The first note of the violin was always haunting. It carried a weight that reverberated through the walls of our house and into my soul. The first time I noticed it, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a sports magazine while Evelyn practiced her violin. She played with her usual precision, her bow gliding across the strings, her body swaying with the music. It was mesmerizing as always, but that evening her playing felt different. There was a lightness to it, a vibrancy, as if she were performing for someone who wasn't me. "New piece?" I asked casually, trying not to sound overly curious. She smiled without turning. "Yeah, Eric suggested it. He thinks it suits me." Eric. The name hit me like an off note in her otherwise perfect melody. I'd heard about him in passing, her colleague in the city orchestra, a talented cellist. I'd met him once at a post-concert dinner, where he flashed a charming grin and made everyone laugh. He seemed harmless enough at the time. Now, the way his name rolled off her tongue sent a chill down my spine. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Evelyn was my wife, my partner of 5 years. We had built a life together, a business, a home. She wasn't the type to stray, or at least I didn't think she was. But still, the nagging feeling lingered. It started with little things. A sudden increase in her orchestra rehearsals, which now ran late into the night. A newfound enthusiasm for dressing up before leaving the house. And the way she guarded her phone, never leaving it face up on the table anymore. Small shifts, subtle but impossible to ignore. One evening, as she prepared to leave for yet another rehearsal, I watched her from the doorway of our bedroom. She wore a fitted dress, elegant but far more daring than her usual style. She caught me staring and paused, her hand brushing against her necklace. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. "Nothing," I said quickly. "You just look different." She laughed softly, a nervous edge to it. "It's just a rehearsal, Liam." I nodded, but something inside me twisted. That unease wouldn't go away. As I sat in the living room after she left, I stared at the empty spot on the couch where she usually curled up next to me. It felt colder than it should have. I tried to push the thoughts aside. I told myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I just didn't know what yet. By the following week, the weight of suspicion had become unbearable. Evelyn's absences were stretching later into the night, and the rehearsals were no longer the comforting excuse they once were. She would come home, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. It was subtle but unmistakable. I began to take notice of every detail. The way she was glued to her phone during dinner, quickly locking the screen whenever I glanced her way. The occasional smile she'd give to some unseen text. I couldn't escape the sinking feeling that I was losing her to someone else. Someone like Eric. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, Evelyn stepped into the other room, her phone still on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with a message, the preview lighting up the screen. My eyes betrayed me and darted toward it. "Eric, can't wait for Thursday. Just us." My hands froze mid-motion, the soapy plate slipping back into the sink. I told myself it could mean anything. Rehearsals, work, a harmless get-together. But deep down, I knew it wasn't harmless. It couldn't be. The next day, I decided to test the waters. I casually asked her about Eric, trying to keep my voice steady. "You two have been working closely lately, huh?" Her response was quick, almost too quick. "Yeah, he's just helping me with a few pieces for the upcoming performance." "Must be nice to have someone so dedicated," I said, studying her reaction. She shrugged, her tone breezy. "He's talented, that's all." She didn't meet my eyes. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The trust one had always taken for granted was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Was I overreacting? Was I being paranoid? Or was this the start of something that would tear our lives apart? By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Evelyn left the house early that evening, dressed impeccably in a black dress I'd never seen before. "It's just a small gathering after rehearsal," she said, kissing me lightly on the cheek. "Don't wait up." I watched her leave, my heart pounding. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I grabbed my phone and called someone I hadn't thought about in years, my old college friend Greg. He was a private investigator now, the kind who specialized in uncovering secrets. "I need your help," I told him, my voice low. "It's about Evelyn." Greg didn't ask many questions. By the end of the call, he had a plan. He'd tail her discreetly and find out the truth. I hated myself for going behind her back like this, but I couldn't go on living in the dark. The next few hours were agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat. Finally, around midnight, Greg sent me a message. "Got something?" Sending photos. I opened the attachments with trembling hands. The first image was Evelyn, sitting at a dimly lit restaurant, leaning across the table toward Eric. Her expression was one I hadn't seen in months, soft, glowing, completely at ease. The second photo hit harder. Eric's hand rested on hers, their fingers interlocked. I couldn't look at the last photo right away. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. When I finally opened it, it felt like the ground beneath me gave way. It showed them standing in the parking lot, his arms around her waist, her lips pressed to his. The phone slipped from my hands, clattering onto the table. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at nothing, my world unraveling. The next morning, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Evelyn hummed softly as she made coffee, her hair still damp from the shower. She looked radiant, as if the weight of life had been lifted off her shoulders. It made me sick. "Good morning," she said, handing me a cup of coffee, her smile almost too perfect. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. Every word she said felt hollow, every gesture tainted. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand answers, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I played along. I want to work like everything was normal, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the photos Greg had sent me. The way her face lit up when she looked at Eric. The kiss. The betrayal. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Greg. "Did you get anything else?" I asked, my voice strained. "Nothing new," he said. But I tailed her to his place after the restaurant. She stayed for about 2 hours. Lights were on, blinds closed. His words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them still felt like a punch to the gut. "Thanks, Greg," I muttered, hanging up before he could respond. That evening, Evelyn came home late again. She slipped off her shoes at the door and walked into the living room, where I sat nursing a drink. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "Sorry I'm so late. Rehearsals ran long." "Did they?" I asked, staring into my glass. She hesitated, the tiniest crack in her confident facade. "Yeah, the concert's next week. You know how it is." I finally looked at her, searching her face for some sign of guilt, some trace of the woman I thought I knew. But all I saw was someone who had perfected the art of deception. Long rehearsals, late dinners, and all for the sake of the music. I said, my tone cutting. "You and Eric must be putting in a lot of work." Her eyes widened, just for a moment, before she composed herself. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Evelyn," I snapped, standing up. "I know." "Know what?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "Liam, you're scaring me." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, don't worry. You've been scaring me for weeks now, with your lies and your secrets. I know about Eric. I know about the restaurant. I know about the kiss." Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it. Then her shoulders slumped, and she sank into the nearest chair. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It just happened." I clenched my fists, anger coursing through me. "It didn't just happen, Evelyn. You made choices. You lied to me, over and over again." "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, sobbing now. "It was a mistake. A horrible mistake." I stared at her, my heart breaking all over again. I wanted to believe her, to forgive her, but the images of her and Eric were burned into my mind. There was no going back. "I need some time," I said, finally, my voice cold. "I can't do this right now." I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, leaving her alone with her guilt. As I drove aimlessly through the night, I tried to make sense of everything. The life we'd built, the trust we'd shared, it was all in ruins. But as the anger and despair threatened to consume me, an idea began to take shape. A plan. I drove for hours, the city lights blurring into a haze as I wrestled with my thoughts. Every memory of Evelyn felt tainted now, every laugh, every kiss. But amid the heartbreak, one thing became crystal clear. I couldn't let this destroy me. I needed to act, not out of rage, but with cold, calculated precision. By the time I returned home, the house was dark. Evelyn was in bed, her silhouette visible under the soft glow of the nightlight. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Part of me still loved her, but the betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Without a word, I turned and went to the guest room. The next day, I called my lawyer. "Liam," she said after hearing me out, "I'm sorry you're going through this. But remember the prenup we put in place before the wedding?" I froze. The prenup. It was a detail I'd almost forgotten in the chaos of the last few days. Back when Evelyn and I got married, my lawyer had insisted on it. At the time, it felt unnecessary, almost insulting. But now it was a lifeline. "What about it?" I asked cautiously. "Remember the clause about the business? Since it was started during your marriage, it technically counts as joint property. But with the prenup in place, you retain full control in the event of infidelity." Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Not hope for my marriage, that was gone, but for something else. Justice. For the next few days, I kept my distance from Evelyn. She tried to talk to me, to explain, but I wasn't ready. I needed time to put my plan into motion. I met with my lawyer in secret, reviewing the terms of the prenup in detail. Every clause, every loophole, it all worked in my favor. Evelyn didn't know it, but the business we'd built together was about to become mine. Fully, irrevocably mine. It was the only thing I could salvage from the wreckage of our marriage. Meanwhile, I played my part. I didn't let on that I knew more than I'd already confronted her with. I let her think I was still grappling with my emotions, still deciding whether to forgive her. It gave me the time I needed to finalize everything. By the end of the week, the papers were ready. My lawyer had drafted the necessary documents, transferring full ownership of the business to me. All I had to do was present them to Evelyn. That evening, I found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red from crying. "Liam," she said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded, sitting across from her at the table. She started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Before you say anything, I have something for you." I slid the papers across the table. She looked at them, confusion clouding her face. "What is this?" "These are papers transferring the business to me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You forfeited your share the moment you decided to betray me." Her eyes widened as she skimmed the documents. "What? You can't do this." "I can, Evelyn, and I already have." I leaned back in my chair, watching as the realization dawned on her. The prenup protected me. "You signed it, remember?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I made a mistake. I was stupid, but this is cruel. Cruel." I laughed bitterly. "You lied to me. You broke our vows. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her hands trembled as she pushed the papers away. "Please, Liam, we can fix this. Don't throw everything away." "I didn't throw it away, Evelyn," I said, standing. "You did." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving her to face the reality of what she'd done. The next morning, Evelyn was quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of her violin practice was absent, replaced by an uneasy stillness. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, the documents still spread out in front of her. Her eyes were puffy, her expression hollow. "I'm not signing this," she said as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I didn't respond immediately. I took a sip, savoring the bitter taste before meeting her gaze. "You don't have a choice, Evelyn. This isn't up for negotiation." Her lips trembled, and for a moment I thought she might break down again. Instead, she stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're punishing me for one mistake. Do you know how unfair that is?" I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. "Unfair? What's unfair is watching the person you love throw away everything for someone else." What's unfair is being lied to day after day while you parade around in someone else's arms. She crossed her arms, defiant. You think this will fix anything? Taking the business? Ruining me? It won't make you feel better. You're right, I said, my voice cold. It won't, but it will give me closure. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Evelyn tried every angle, anger, guilt, even nostalgia, to sway me. She brought up the early days of our relationship, the dreams we'd built together, the sacrifices we'd made. But her words only deepened the divide between us. The business had been our shared project, a testament to our teamwork. Taking it from her wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming something she had tainted with her betrayal. Every time I thought of her and Eric, I pictured her in the office, laughing with me, brainstorming ideas, while secretly harboring lies. Finally, she broke. I'll sign, she said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. But only because I know you'll never let this go. I nodded, emotionless. You're right. I won't. The day she signed the papers, I felt an odd mix of triumph and emptiness. Watching her scribble her name at the bottom of the document should have felt like victory, but it didn't. It felt hollow, like winning a battle in a war I'd already lost. As I walked into my lawyer's office with the signed documents, I couldn't help but reflect on how things had come to this. 5 years of marriage reduced to a legal transaction. A love that once felt unbreakable, now shattered beyond repair. You're officially the sole owner, my lawyer said, sliding the finalized papers across the desk. I nodded, slipping them into my briefcase. Thanks, Liam, she said, her tone softer. I know this isn't the outcome you wanted. If you ever need someone to talk to. I cut her off with a forced smile. I'll be fine. But I wasn't sure that was true. That evening, Evelyn packed her bags. She didn't say much, just a quiet goodbye as she stood by the door. I nodded, unable to muster a response. As the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in weeks, I was alone, truly alone. The house, once filled with music and laughter, now felt like a tomb. I wandered from room to room, unsure of what to do with myself. The business was mine, but what did that mean? What did I have left? I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, staring at nothing. This was what I wanted, or at least what I thought I wanted. But the revenge I'd orchestrated didn't bring me the satisfaction I'd expected. It only left me with the ruins of what used to be. The days that followed felt surreal. The house was eerily quiet, as if it, too, mourned Evelyn's absence. The sound of her violin, once a constant presence, had been replaced by an oppressive silence. I thought I'd feel free, unburdened, but instead, the emptiness consumed me. I poured myself into the business, working late into the night to avoid going home. The office became my refuge, its sterile walls and buzzing fluorescent lights a welcome distraction from the ghosts that haunted the house. The business was mine now, completely mine, but it felt like a hollow victory. Every corner of it reminded me of Evelyn. Her laughter during brainstorming sessions, her meticulous notes scrawled across the whiteboards, her coffee mug still sitting on the desk where she once worked. I thought revenge would give me closure, but all it gave me was loneliness. One evening, as I sat at my desk, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Greg, the investigator. Thought you want to see this. Attached was a photo of Evelyn. She was sitting at a small cafe, her violin case propped against the chair beside her. Across the table sat Eric. They weren't touching, but their expressions said everything. She looked different, not guilty or ashamed, but calm, resigned. I stared at the photo for a long time, my emotions warring within me. Anger flared briefly, but it was quickly overtaken by something else, sadness. She wasn't mine anymore. She never really had been, not for a long time, and maybe I hadn't been hers either. That night, I went through the things she'd left behind. A few clothes in the closet, a book she'd been reading on the nightstand, and tucked away in a drawer, a framed photo of the two of us from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so full of hope. It felt like another lifetime. I sat on the bed, holding the photo, and for the first time since everything happened, I let myself cry. Not out of anger or betrayal, but grief. Grief for the life we'd lost, for the love that had once been so strong. I thought about the moments we'd shared, the dreams we'd built together, and how easily it had all fallen apart. I thought revenge would make me stronger, but all it had done was leave me more broken. The next day, I made a decision. I packed up the rest of Evelyn's things, careful to fold each item neatly. I didn't want to be cruel anymore. I didn't want to hold on to the bitterness. I called her and told her I'd drop them off at her new place. She sounded surprised but agreed. When I arrived, she was waiting at the door, her expression guarded. For a moment, we just stood there, neither of us knowing what to say. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice soft. I nodded, setting the box down. I thought you'd want your things." She hesitated, then said, "Liam, I'm sorry. For everything." I met her gaze, and for the first time, I saw the pain in her eyes. It mirrored my own. "I know," I said quietly. "I am too." We stood there for a while, the silence heavy between us. There was nothing left to say, no words that could undo the damage. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving her and the past behind. The drive home from Evelyn's place was long and quiet. For the first time in weeks, my anger had dissipated. What replaced it wasn't relief or satisfaction. It was exhaustion. I had spent so much time consumed by what she'd done, by what I'd lost, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. When I got home, the emptiness hit me again. The house felt cavernous without her presence, and though I had reclaimed it in every way that mattered, it didn't feel like mine. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Finally, I ended up in the office, staring at the papers that had sealed our fate. The prenup, the ownership transfer, all of it. I shoved them into a drawer and closed it, as if locking them away could somehow put everything behind me. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild. The business, now solely mine, became my focus. I hired new staff, streamlined operations, and threw myself into projects with a single-minded determination. On the surface, I was thriving. Friends and colleagues praised me for how well I was handling everything, how I'd come out on top. But inside, I was still unraveling. Every so often, I caught myself reaching for my phone to text Evelyn, forgetting for a brief moment that she wasn't there anymore. I avoided places we used to go together. The coffee shop where we'd brainstormed ideas, the park where we'd walk hand in hand. Even the music she used to play was unbearable. I'd catch snippets of Violin on the radio or in a movie, and my chest would tighten until I had to turn it off. One afternoon, I stopped by the cafe near my office for lunch. As I sat by the window, sipping coffee, a familiar melody floated through the air. Someone was playing the violin on the street outside, a busker, their case open for tips. The sound stopped me in my tracks. For the first time in weeks, I didn't turn away from the music. I let it wash over me, each note stirring something deep inside. It wasn't Evelyn playing. It wasn't even the same style, but it reminded me of her, of us, of everything I had lost. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I just sat there, letting the music fill the empty spaces in my heart. That evening, I called Greg. "Hey," I said when he picked up, "I just wanted to thank you for everything." "You okay, Liam?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I think I will be," I said, surprising myself with how true the words felt. "I'm done chasing ghosts." We talked for a while, and when I hung up, I felt lighter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Slowly, life began to find its rhythm again. I started going out with friends, reconnecting with people I'd neglected during the chaos of the last few months. I even went to a gallery opening one night, where a colleague introduced me to someone, a woman named Claire. She was kind and easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something that wasn't pain. I wasn't ready to dive into anything new, but it was a reminder that life could still hold good things, even after so much had been lost. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself rebuilding, not just my life, but myself. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. Some days were harder than others, There were mornings when I woke up and instinctively reached for Evelyn, only to be met by the cold, empty side of the bed. But those moments, while painful, no longer crushed me the way they once had. The business became a steady anchor. With Evelyn gone, I had to make decisions on my own, and while daunting at first, it became empowering. I expanded our client base, brought in fresh ideas, and even took a risk on a new product line. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud, not just of the business, but of myself. I was standing on my own 2 feet. One Saturday, I found myself wandering through the local park. It was one of those crisp fall days, the air cool but not cold, the trees alive with fiery reds and oranges. I hadn't been here since Evelyn and I used to walk these paths, her hand tucked into mine. But today, I didn't feel the familiar pang of loss. Instead, I felt peaceful. As I rounded a corner, I heard the faint strains of a violin. My steps faltered. For a moment, I thought it might be her, that I'd turn the corner and see Evelyn playing under one of the old oaks. But when I followed the sound, it wasn't her. It was a young woman, maybe 20, her hair tucked under a knit cap, playing with an intensity that reminded me of why I fell in love with music, and Evelyn, in the first place. I stopped to listen, the music washing over me. It was raw, imperfect, but beautiful. When she finished, I dropped a few bills into her case and smiled. "That was incredible," I said. She grinned, a little shy. "Thanks. I'm just starting out." "You've got something special," I said, meaning it. "Don't stop." As I walked away, I realized that for the first time in a long while, the sound of a violin didn't hurt. It felt like closure. The following week, I got an unexpected call from Evelyn. Seeing her name on my phone made my stomach twist, but I answered. "Hi, Liam," she said, her voice hesitant. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "No," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What's up?" I wanted to apologize. Again. For everything. And to thank you for dropping off my things. You didn't have to do that." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her how much she'd hurt me, to make her understand the depth of her betrayal. But another part, the part that had spent months trying to heal, just wanted to let it go. "Thanks," I said finally. "I appreciate that." There was a long pause. "I hope you're doing okay," she said. "I am," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. Later that night, I sat in the living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand, and thought about the conversation. It didn't feel like closure, not entirely, but it felt like a step forward. Evelyn and I would never go back to what we were, but maybe, someday, we could both find peace. As I sipped my drink, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Hurt, yes. Sad, yes. But the anger that had once burned so brightly had finally burned out. Evelyn looked up as I approached, her fingers faltering on the strings. For a brief moment, her eyes widened in surprise before she set the violin down gently beside her. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park, and the faint sound of children laughing in the distance seemed oddly out of place against the tension between us. "Liam," she said, her voice soft and cautious, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say my name. "Evelyn," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what to say or why I had even walked over. But then I gestured to the blanket. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." I lowered myself onto the edge of the blanket, leaving a respectful distance between us. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. "You still play?" I finally said, nodding toward the violin. She gave a small, sad smile. "Not as much as I used to, but it's comforting. Familiar." I nodded, understanding all too well the need for something steady when everything else falls apart. "You were always brilliant with it." "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence returned, stretching longer this time. I watched as a breeze played with the edge of her blanket, lifting it slightly before letting it fall again. I thought about all the things I wanted to say to her, the questions I'd never asked, the anger I'd swallowed. But when I opened my mouth, none of that came out. "Are you okay?" I asked instead. She looked at me, her eyes softening. "I'm trying to be. It hasn't been easy, but I'm figuring things out." I nodded, the words hitting closer to home than I expected. Yeah, me too. Her gaze dropped to the violin. I've thought about reaching out to you, but I didn't know if you want to hear from me. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything between us. There were times I didn't, but I'm not angry anymore, Evelyn. Not like I was. Her lips trembled, and she looked away, blinking quickly. I never meant to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. You have to know that. I know, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. But you did, and I don't think either of us can change that. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I regret it every day. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the familiar stab of bitterness when she cried. Instead, I felt tired of carrying the weight of what had happened, tired of holding on to the pain, tired of living in the past. I think we both have things we regret, I said gently. But we can't stay there forever. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of hope and sadness. Do you think we could ever? No, I said softly, cutting her off. We can't go back. Too much has happened. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. Separately. She wiped her tears and nodded. I understand. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, I stood up. Evelyn followed, her violin case in hand. Take care of yourself, I said, offering her a small smile. You too, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. And with that, we walked away from each other. No anger, no resentment, just two people letting go. The encounter with Evelyn stayed with me, but not in the way I expected. I didn't replay it obsessively or let it drag me back into the past. Instead, it felt like the closing of a chapter, a final note in a melody I'd been humming for too long. For the first time, I felt ready to move forward. The business had flourished under my sole leadership, but for months it had been my escape, not my passion. Now I began to view it differently. I reconnected with the reasons I'd started it in the first place. The excitement of creating something from nothing, the challenge of building a vision into reality. It wasn't just about keeping busy anymore. It was about building something that reflected who I had become. Outside of work, I started to explore new things. I took up hiking, spending weekends on trails that wound through quiet forests and up into breathtaking overlooks. The stillness of nature offered a peace I hadn't realized I needed. I joined a local cooking class, where I met people who had nothing to do with my old life. It was liberating to be around strangers who didn't know my story. And then there was Claire. We ran into each other again at an art gallery opening. She was admiring a painting, her head tilted slightly as if trying to decipher its meaning. I recognized her immediately. My colleague had introduced us months ago, but at the time, I'd been too caught up in my own turmoil to truly notice her. This time was different. Trying to figure it out? I asked, stepping up beside her. She glanced at me and smiled. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just enjoying not knowing for once. Her answer caught me off guard, and we fell into an easy conversation. She was thoughtful and sharp, with a dry sense of humor that kept me laughing. By the end of the night, I found myself asking if she'd like to grab coffee sometime. To my surprise and relief, she said yes. Our first coffee date turned into a second, and then a third. Claire wasn't like Evelyn. She didn't play the violin or have a poetic soul, but she had a steadiness about her, a practicality that balanced out her warmth. She was curious, always asking questions, always eager to learn. Being around her felt easy, like breathing. One evening, as we walked through the park, she stopped suddenly, looking up at the sky. Do you ever think about how much space there is up there? She asked, her voice thoughtful. All the things we'll never know? I smiled, following her gaze. I used to think I needed all the answers, I admitted. But now I think I'm okay with not knowing everything. She looked at me then, her eyes soft. That's a good place to be. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I was in that place, content with not knowing what the future held, but ready to embrace it nonetheless. Evelyn and I never spoke again after that day in the park. I heard from mutual friends that she moved to another city, started teaching music lessons. I wished her well in my heart, but I didn't dwell on it. That part of my life was over, and I had no desire to revisit it. Life moved forward, as it always does. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer hurt. They were just reminders of where I'd been, of what I'd overcome. And as I stood on the edge of something new with Claire, I felt a quiet sense of hope. Not the naive, all-consuming kind I'd had with Evelyn, but something gentler, steadier, something real. Because sometimes moving on isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to carry the past with you, without letting it weigh you down. And I was finally ready to carry it. What are your thoughts on my story? Let me know in the comments what you think about my choice and how you might have dealt with it.